The faded photograph trembled in Margaret Chen's weathered hands as she stared at the unmistakable faces of Bonnie Parker and Clyde Barrow, their signatures scrawled across what appeared to be detailed bank floor plans and escape routes that had never been found by law enforcement. The dusty attic around her seemed to hold its breath as the magnitude of her discovery settled in, 87 years after the notorious criminals had met their violent end on a Louisiana back road. But before we dive into how a desperate widow's search through her grandmother's forgotten belongings would uncover one of American crime history's greatest mysteries, let me tell you where this extraordinary journey began. Margaret Chen had never imagined she'd be 42 years old, standing in the ruins of what used to be her comfortable middle-class life, holding an eviction notice that gave her exactly 14 days to vacate the modest two-bedroom house in Riverside, California, that had been her sanctuary for the past 18 months since David's funeral. The medical bills from her husband's 2-year battle with pancreatic cancer had consumed their savings, their retirement accounts, and finally their home equity, leaving Margaret with a pile of debt that seemed to grow larger every month despite her best efforts to chip away at it. The morning sun streamed through the kitchen window, illuminating the stack of past-due notices spread across the oak table David had built with his own hands during their second year of marriage. Electric company, water department, credit card companies, the mortgage lender, all demanding payments she simply couldn't make on her part-time income from the local library where she'd worked for the past 15 years. Her supervisor, Mrs. Patterson, had been sympathetic about Margaret's need for flexible hours during David's illness. But the library's budget constraints meant there were no full-time positions available, and at 42, Margaret was discovering that employers weren't particularly interested in hiring widows with gaps in their work history. She tried everything she could think of, applied for dozens of jobs that paid decent wages, only to be told she was either overqualified or underqualified, too old or too inexperienced, depending on the position. She'd sold David's tools, his fishing equipment, her grandmother's china set, and most of her jewelry, but the money had barely made a dent in the mounting bills. The life insurance policy that was supposed to provide security had been exhausted, paying for experimental treatments that insurance wouldn't cover, treatments that had bought David an extra 6 months, but ultimately couldn't save him. Margaret folded the eviction notice carefully and placed it in the manila folder where she kept all the other documents that marked the systematic dismantling of her life. Bankruptcy was looking inevitable, but even that process required money she didn't have for attorney fees. She'd been putting off the phone calls to bankruptcy lawyers, hoping against hope that something would change, that some opportunity would present itself, that the impossible situation would somehow resolve itself through sheer determination and careful budgeting. The ringing telephone interrupted her gloomy inventory of financial disasters. The caller ID showed a number she didn't recognize, and Margaret's first instinct was to let it go to voicemail, assuming it was another collection agency or automated debt collection call. But something made her pick up the phone, perhaps the desperate hope that it might be someone calling about one of the job applications she'd submitted. "Mrs. Chen." The voice belonged to an elderly woman with a slight Texas accent. "This is Eleanor Whitfield. I'm calling about your grandmother, Rose McKinnon." Margaret felt confusion wash over her. Her grandmother Rose had died when Margaret was 12 years old, over 30 years ago. She had only fragmentary memories of the woman who had lived in a small house in Bakersfield, California, and had seemed ancient and mysterious to young Margaret during their infrequent visits. "I'm sorry," Margaret said carefully. "There must be some mistake. My grandmother passed away decades ago." "Oh, honey, I know that," Eleanor replied with a gentle laugh. "I was Rose's neighbor for 43 years, right up until she died. I'm calling because I've been the caretaker of her house all this time, and I'm finally ready to sell my own place and move to Arizona to be closer to my grandchildren. But I can't do that until Rose's house is properly dealt with." Margaret sank into one of the kitchen chairs, trying to process this information. "I don't understand. What happened to my grandmother's house after she died?" "Well, that's the thing," Eleanor continued. "Rose left everything to your mother, but your mother never came to claim it. The property taxes have been getting paid through an old bank account Rose set up, and I've been keeping an eye on the place, but legally it all belongs to your family. When your mother passed away a few years back, I assume it transferred to you." Margaret's mind raced. Her mother had never mentioned inheriting anything from grandmother Rose. In fact, her mother had rarely talked about Rose at all, beyond occasional comments about how difficult and secretive the old woman had been. Margaret had assumed there was nothing to inherit, that her grandmother had lived in poverty and left nothing behind but memories. "Are you saying my grandmother owned a house that's been sitting empty for 30 years? Margaret asked, hardly daring to believe what she was hearing. "Not just a house, honey," Eleanor replied. "Rose owned her house free and clear, plus she had that big old garage out back that she used for storage, and there's probably 30 years' worth of belongings still inside. The place is in decent shape considering. I've had the roof fixed a couple times and made sure the pipes didn't freeze, but it needs someone to go through all Rose's things and decide what to do with the property." Margaret felt something stirring in her chest that she hadn't experienced in months. Hope, not the desperate, grasping hope she'd been clinging to while watching her life fall apart, but genuine possibility. "Mrs. Whitfield, are you saying I own this property? As far as I know, you're Rose's only living relative, so yes, I believe it's yours now. I've got all the paperwork Rose left with me, including the deed and her will. Your grandmother was a careful woman about legal matters. I'll give her that. She left very specific instructions about what should happen to her belongings." Margaret's hands were shaking as she reached for a pen and paper. "Can you give me the address? I'd like to come see the property as soon as possible." Eleanor provided detailed directions to the house on Maple Street in Bakersfield, along with her own contact information and the location of a spare key Rose had hidden for emergencies. "One thing I should warn you about," Eleanor added. "Rose was quite the collector. That woman never threw anything away, and she lived in that house for over 50 years. There's a lot to go through." After hanging up the phone, Margaret sat in her kitchen, staring at the address she'd written down, trying to absorb the implications of this unexpected development. If she really did own property in Bakersfield, even property that needed work, it might be enough to get her out of her current financial crisis. She could sell the house and use the money to pay off her debts and find a fresh start somewhere else. Or she could move to Bakersfield and live rent-free while she tried to rebuild her life. Margaret looked around her kitchen, taking in the familiar surroundings that would soon belong to someone else. The bank had made it clear that foreclosure proceedings would begin immediately if she couldn't bring her mortgage current, and she'd already exhausted every possible source of funds. David's pension had died with him, leaving her with only Social Security survivor benefits that weren't enough to cover basic living expenses, much less catch up on months of missed payments. She spent the rest of the morning researching Bakersfield, real estate prices online, trying to get a sense of what her grandmother's property might be worth. The neighborhood where Rose had lived seemed to be undergoing gentrification, with older homes being renovated and sold at prices that made Margaret's head spin. Even a modest house in decent condition could be worth enough to solve all her immediate financial problems. By noon, Margaret had made her decision. She called the library and asked for a few days off, explaining that she had a family emergency to deal with. Then she threw some clothes into an overnight bag, loaded her aging Honda Civic with cleaning supplies and basic tools, and headed north toward Bakersfield. The drive gave her time to think about her grandmother Rose, trying to remember details from those childhood visits that had seemed so boring at the time. Rose had been a stern woman in her 70s, with steel-grey hair pulled back in a tight bun and eyes that seemed to see everything. Margaret's mother had always been tense during those visits, hurrying Margaret through conversations with Rose and cutting the trip short whenever possible. Looking back, Margaret wondered if there had been some family conflict she'd been too young to understand. She remembered Rose's house as being dark and cluttered, filled with old furniture and stacks of books and papers that Rose had forbidden her to touch. There had been a musty smell throughout the house, like old leather and paper, and something else Margaret couldn't identify. Rose had spent most of her time in what she called her study, a room Margaret had glimpsed only briefly, but which had seemed to contain dozens of filing cabinets and boxes of documents. Margaret's mother had always said that Rose was obsessed with family history and genealogy, spending hours poring over old records and documents. "Your grandmother thinks she's some kind of amateur historian," her mother had said dismissively, "always digging up old stories that are better left buried." At the time, Margaret had thought her mother was just being critical, but now she wondered if there had been more to Rose's research than simple genealogical curiosity. Eleanor Whitfield was waiting on the front porch when Margaret arrived at the Maple Street address. The elderly woman was exactly as Margaret had imagined from their phone conversation, petite and energetic, despite her 78 years, with white hair and kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. The house itself was a modest craftsman style bungalow with good bones but obvious signs of deferred maintenance. The paint was faded, the front steps needed repair, and the small front yard was overgrown with weeds, but the structure looked solid. "You must be Margaret," Eleanor said, rising from her porch chair with a warm smile. "You look just like Rose did when she was younger, same dark hair and determined expression." Margaret accepted Eleanor's embrace, surprised by how good it felt to be welcomed by someone who had known her grandmother. "Thank you so much for taking care of the property all these years. I had no idea it existed." Eleanor led Margaret up the front steps, producing an old-fashioned skeleton key from her pocket. "Rose was very specific about wanting the house to stay in the family. She made me promise to contact you if anything happened to your mother. I should have called sooner, but I kept hoping your mother would eventually come deal with things herself." The front door opened with a creak that echoed through the silent interior. Margaret stepped inside and was immediately transported back to her childhood visits. The house smelled exactly as she remembered: old paper, leather, dust, and that mysterious underlying scent she still couldn't identify. The living room was exactly as Rose had left it, with heavy Victorian furniture draped in white sheets and stacks of books covering every available surface. "I haven't moved anything," Eleanor explained, following Margaret's gaze around the cluttered room. Rose left very specific instructions that nothing should be disturbed until a family member could go through it properly. She said there were important things hidden throughout the house that needed to be handled carefully. Margaret walked slowly through the rooms, taking inventory of the overwhelming amount of belongings her grandmother had accumulated. The dining room table was covered with file folders and loose papers. The kitchen cabinets were stuffed with dishes, cookbooks, and more papers. Every bedroom contained furniture, boxes, and stacks of documents. It would take weeks to go through everything properly. "The real challenge is going to be the garage," Eleanor said, leading Margaret through the kitchen to the back door. "Rose used it as her main storage area. I think there's 50 years' worth of collecting out there." Margaret opened the back door and gasped. The garage was enormous, much larger than it had appeared from the outside, and it was packed floor to ceiling with boxes, filing cabinets, old furniture, and items covered with tarps. Narrow pathways wound between the stacks, creating a maze of stored belongings that seemed to go on forever. "My goodness," Margaret whispered. "How did one person accumulate so much?" Rose was a researcher, Eleanor replied, always buying old documents and records at estate sales and auctions. She said she was preserving history that other people were throwing away. I used to help her carry boxes in here, but I never saw what was inside them. Margaret walked carefully along one of the pathways, noting that many of the boxes were labeled with dates and locations in Rose's careful handwriting. 1920s, 1930s Texas, Depression-era California, Dust Bowl migration, railroad records, 1925, 1940. It appeared that Rose had indeed been some kind of amateur historian, collecting primary source documents from a specific time period and geographic region. As they made their way back to the house, Eleanor handed Margaret a manila envelope. These are all the legal documents Rose left for her heir. The deed to the property, her will, and some other papers she said were important. She also left this letter for whoever inherited the house. Margaret opened the envelope and found a handwritten letter in Rose's familiar, spidery handwriting. "My dear descendant," it began, "if you are reading this, it means I am gone, and you have inherited both my worldly possessions and the responsibility that comes with them. What you will find in this house is not merely the collection of an old woman's curiosity, but evidence of events that shaped our family's history in ways you cannot yet imagine. I have spent my entire adult life gathering proof of things that were hidden, protecting secrets that powerful people wanted to stay buried. Some of what you discover may frighten you. Some of it may tempt you. All of it will change how you understand our family's place in American history. Proceed carefully, trust no one completely, and remember that the truth is often more valuable than gold, but also more dangerous. Your loving grandmother, Rose McKinnon." Margaret read the letter twice, feeling a chill that had nothing to do with the late afternoon breeze. What kind of secrets had her grandmother been keeping, and what responsibility was Margaret inheriting along with the property? Eleanor was watching her with concern. "Is everything all right, honey? You look like you've seen a ghost." Margaret folded the letter carefully and tucked it back into the envelope. "I think I'm going to need more than a few days to sort through all this." "You take all the time you need," Eleanor replied. "I'll keep an eye on the place while you're here. And Margaret, your grandmother was a good woman, but she carried some heavy burdens. Whatever you find in there, remember that Rose spent her whole life trying to do the right thing with difficult knowledge." As Eleanor walked back to her own house next door, Margaret stood in Rose's kitchen, looking out at the garage full of mysteries and feeling the weight of her grandmother's words. She'd come to Bakersfield hoping to find a simple solution to her financial problems, a piece of property she could sell to get back on her feet. Instead, she was beginning to suspect she'd inherited something far more complicated and potentially valuable than real estate. The eviction notice in her purse reminded her that she had less than 2 weeks to turn her situation around. Whatever secrets Rose had been protecting, whatever proof of things that were hidden filled those boxes in the garage, Margaret was going to have to uncover them quickly if they were going to help her save her future. As the sun set over Bakersfield, Margaret Chen stood at the threshold of her grandmother's house, holding the key to mysteries that had been waiting 30 years for someone to unlock them. Tomorrow, she would begin the process of discovery that would change not only her understanding of her family's history, but her entire life. Margaret spent her first night in Rose's house, lying awake on the dusty sofa in the living room, listening to the unfamiliar creaks and settling sounds of a house that had been empty for 3 decades. Every shadow seemed to hold secrets, and every sound made her wonder what she might discover once she began seriously exploring her grandmother's collection. She'd brought a sleeping bag from home, but the Victorian horsehair sofa was surprisingly comfortable despite its age, and she found herself staring at the ceiling, trying to make sense of Rose's cryptic letter. Dawn brought California sunshine streaming through windows that hadn't been properly cleaned in years, casting dancing dust motes through the air and illuminating the true scope of what Margaret faced. In daylight, Rose's house revealed itself to be even more packed with belongings than she'd initially realized. Every room contained layers of accumulated items. Furniture stacked on furniture, boxes wedged into every available space, and papers organized in systems that only Rose had understood. Margaret made coffee using grounds she'd brought from home and Rose's ancient percolator, then sat at the kitchen table to develop a systematic approach to her exploration. The most logical starting point seemed to be Rose's study, the room her mother had mentioned and that Margaret remembered as being forbidden territory during childhood visits. Located off the main hallway, the study door had been locked yesterday when Eleanor showed her through the house, but Margaret found an ornate skeleton key hanging on a hook inside the kitchen pantry. The study door opened to reveal a room that took Margaret's breath away. Unlike the rest of the house, which showed signs of general collecting and accumulation, the study was clearly the workspace of someone with serious research skills and specific objectives. 3 walls were lined, floor to ceiling, with filing cabinets, each drawer meticulously labeled with dates, locations, and subject categories. The 4th wall contained a massive corkboard covered with photographs, newspaper clippings, maps, and handwritten notes connected by colored string in patterns that suggested some kind of investigation or timeline. Rose's desk dominated the center of the room, a massive oak piece that must have weighed several hundred pounds. Its surface was covered with magnifying glasses, reference books, and neat stacks of documents held down by antique paperweights. Multiple desk lamps provided focused lighting for detailed work, and a high-backed leather chair showed the indentations of countless hours of dedicated research. Margaret approached the corkboard cautiously, trying to decipher the connections Rose had mapped out. The photographs were a mixture of official portraits, candid shots, and what appeared to be surveillance images, all showing people from what looked like the 1920s and 1930s based on their clothing and hairstyles. Some faces appeared multiple times in different photographs, and Rose had marked certain individuals with colored pins and handwritten annotations. In the center of the board, 2 photographs dominated the display. Margaret recognized them immediately. From countless true crime documentaries and history books, Bonnie Parker and Clyde Barrow, the Depression-era bank robbers whose crime spree had captivated and terrified the American public. But these weren't the usual publicity photos or police mugshots. These appeared to be personal snapshots showing Bonnie and Clyde in relaxed moments, laughing and embracing like any young couple in love. Surrounding the central photographs, Rose had arranged dozens of other images showing various individuals in different locations. Red string connected some photos to newspaper clippings about bank robberies, police pursuits, and violent encounters. Blue string linked other images to what appeared to be family photographs and personal documents. Green string connected several photos to maps of Texas, Oklahoma, Louisiana, and other states where Bonnie and Clyde had operated. Margaret found herself drawn to a section of the board that seemed to focus on people who weren't Bonnie and Clyde themselves, but who appeared to be connected to them in some way. Rose had labeled these individuals as associates, safe house operators, and family connections. One photograph in particular caught Margaret's attention. A young woman with dark hair and serious eyes, labeled in Rose's handwriting as Rose McKinnon, age 19, Dallas, Texas, 1933. The shock of recognition hit Margaret like a physical blow. Her grandmother had known Bonnie and Clyde personally. Rose hadn't just been researching the famous outlaws as an amateur historian. She had been part of their world, connected to their story in ways that had never been documented in any official account of their crimes. Margaret sank into Rose's, desk chair trying to process the implications of this discovery. If Rose had been personally involved with Bonnie and Clyde, what did that mean for Margaret's family history? What secrets had Rose been protecting, and what responsibility had she inherited along with the house? She began systematically examining the filing cabinets, starting with the drawer labeled Personal Family History. Inside, she found folders containing birth certificates, marriage licenses, and other family documents going back several generations. But mixed in with the routine genealogical materials were items that made Margaret's pulse quicken. Western Union telegrams with coded messages, letters postmarked from various cities throughout the Southwest, and photographs of Rose with people Margaret didn't recognize. One folder was labeled Dallas 1932-1934 and contained what appeared to be Rose's personal correspondence from that period. Margaret opened it carefully, finding dozens of letters written in Rose's young handwriting to someone named Mama in California. The letters told a story that Margaret had never heard from any family member. According to Rose's letters, she had moved to Dallas as a teenager to work as a seamstress and had quickly become involved with a crowd of young people who lived on the margins of society during the worst years of the Great Depression. Rose wrote about friends who were struggling to find work, families who had lost their farms, and young men who had turned to petty crime to survive. The letters painted a picture of a generation that felt abandoned by society and increasingly willing to take desperate measures. "Mama," Rose had written in one letter dated March 1933, "I know you worry about the people I'm spending time with, but you have to understand that these aren't bad people, just desperate ones. Bonnie is actually very sweet when you get to know her, and she's incredibly loyal to the people she cares about. Clyde has been hurt by the system so many times that he's given up on playing by rules that were never designed to help people like us. I'm not saying what they're doing is right, but I understand why they're doing it." Margaret continued reading, fascinated by this glimpse into her grandmother's youth and increasingly concerned about what it might mean. The letters revealed that Rose had worked as a seamstress not just for legitimate customers, but also for people who needed clothing altered quickly and without questions asked. She had provided safe houses for people on the run, and she had helped transfer messages and money between various criminal associates. But Rose's letters also revealed a growing discomfort with the violence that was becoming increasingly common in her circle of friends. "Mama," she wrote in a letter dated December 1933, "things are getting dangerous here. People are carrying guns all the time now, and there's talk about jobs that could get people killed. I'm thinking about coming home to California, but I'm afraid of leaving my friends when they might need help." The final letter in the folder was dated April 1934, just a month before Bonnie and Clyde were killed in Louisiana. "Mama," Rose wrote, "something terrible is going to happen soon. Bonnie gave me a package yesterday and made me promise to keep it safe, no matter what happens to her and Clyde. She said it contains things that could hurt innocent people if they fell into the wrong hands, but that someday someone trustworthy might need to know the truth about what really happened during these past 2 years. I'm scared, Mama. I'm scared for my friends, and I'm scared about what I've gotten myself into. I'm coming home as soon as I can arrange it." Margaret sat back, in Rose's chair, her mind racing. Her grandmother had been given something by Bonnie Parker just before the famous outlaws were killed, something important enough that Rose had spent the rest of her life protecting it. Whatever Bonnie had entrusted to Rose was presumably somewhere in this house, hidden among decades of accumulated research and belongings. Margaret returned to examining the corkboard, this time focusing on the timeline Rose had constructed. The colored strings now made more sense. Red represented confirmed criminal activities, blue showed personal relationships and family connections, and green marked locations where significant events had occurred. But there was also yellow string, which seemed to connect certain photos and documents to question marks and notes reading "unresolved" and "needs verification." One cluster of yellow connections centered around a photograph of a well-dressed man in his 40s standing next to an expensive automobile. Rose had labeled him J.R. Hamilton, Dallas banker, suspected corruption. Yellow string connected this photo to newspaper clippings about bank failures during the Depression and to what appeared to be handwritten notes about suspicious financial transactions. Another yellow cluster focused on photographs of several men in law enforcement uniforms. Rose had noted possible corruption, need proof, next to images of what appeared to be police officers and federal agents. The yellow strings connected these photos to newspaper articles about failed raids, advance warnings given to criminals, and suspiciously lenient sentences for certain offenders. Margaret began to understand what Rose had been researching for all these years. Her grandmother hadn't just been collecting information about Bonnie and Clyde as historical figures. She had been investigating the broader network of corruption, desperation, and systemic failure that had made their crime spree possible. Rose had been trying to document not just what the famous outlaws had done, but who had helped them, who had profited from their activities, and who had covered up the truth about their connections to legitimate society. The implications were staggering. If Rose had evidence of corruption involving banks, law enforcement, and other powerful institutions from the 1930s, that information could still be valuable and dangerous decades later. Families, businesses, and political careers could be built on foundations that wouldn't survive exposure of their connections to Depression-era criminal activities. Margaret spent the rest of the morning exploring more filing cabinets, finding folder after folder of meticulously organized evidence. Rose had collected bank records, police reports, court documents, and personal correspondence spanning decades. She had tracked the careers of law enforcement officers who had been involved in the Bonnie and Clyde investigation, noting which ones had received unusual promotions or had acquired wealth that seemed inconsistent with their official salaries. She had also researched the families of various criminals, documenting what had happened to wives, children, and relatives after the famous outlaws were killed or imprisoned. Many of these people had disappeared from public records entirely, suggesting they had either changed their identities or been provided with new lives in exchange for their silence about what they had witnessed. One filing cabinet was devoted entirely to financial records from banks throughout Texas, Oklahoma, and Louisiana during the 1930s. Rose had somehow obtained internal documents showing unusual transactions, mysterious account closures, and patterns of money movement that suggested systematic laundering of stolen funds. The level of detail was extraordinary, implying that Rose had either had access to inside sources or had spent decades filing freedom of information requests and tracking down retired employees willing to talk. Margaret found herself both impressed by her grandmother's dedication and increasingly worried about what she had gotten herself into. If Rose had been protecting evidence that could expose historical corruption involving still powerful families and institutions, then Margaret's inheritance included not just financial opportunity, but potentially serious danger. The most disturbing discovery came in a filing cabinet labeled Threats and Warnings. Inside, Margaret found copies of letters Rose had received over the years from lawyers representing various parties, all requesting or demanding that she cease her research activities and turn over any materials she had collected. The letters were carefully worded to avoid explicit threats, but their message was clear. Powerful people were aware of Rose's activities and wanted them stopped. Mixed in with the legal correspondence were more direct warnings. Anonymous phone. Calls Rose had documented in a logbook suspicious individuals who had been seen watching her house, and even what appeared to be a break-in attempt that Rose had reported to local police. The pattern suggested that Rose's research had made her enemies, people who were willing to use intimidation to protect secrets they thought were buried with Bonnie and Clyde. Margaret realized that by inheriting Rose's house and belongings, she had also inherited these enemies. Anyone who had been trying to suppress Rose's research would now be concerned about what Margaret might do with the information her grandmother had spent a lifetime collecting. As she sat in Rose's study, surrounded by evidence of decades of careful investigation and systematic intimidation, Margaret understood that her financial crisis was suddenly the least of her problems. She had come to Bakersfield hoping to find something valuable enough to solve her immediate money troubles. Instead, she had discovered that she was now the guardian of information that could rewrite the history of America's most famous criminal couple and expose corruption that had been covered up for nearly a century. The question was what to do with this dangerous inheritance. Rose's letter had warned that the truth could be more valuable than gold, but also more dangerous. Margaret was beginning to understand exactly what her grandmother had meant, and she was starting to realize that the next decision she made could determine not just her financial future, but possibly her survival. Outside Rose's study window, the quiet residential street of Bakersfield looked peaceful and ordinary. But Margaret now knew that appearances could be deceiving and that the most dangerous secrets were often hidden in the most unremarkable places. Her grandmother had spent 30 years protecting explosive information in this modest house, and now that responsibility had fallen to Margaret. She had less than 2 weeks before her eviction deadline, and she was beginning to suspect that selling Rose's house and walking away might not be as simple as she had hoped. The people who had been watching Rose all these years would undoubtedly be watching Margaret now, waiting to see what she would do with her dangerous inheritance. Margaret spent the next morning methodically searching Rose's house for whatever Bonnie Parker had entrusted to her grandmother in those final weeks before the infamous ambush in Louisiana. She started with the most obvious hiding places, behind books, inside furniture, beneath floorboards, but found nothing except dust and the occasional mouse nest. Rose had been too careful, too experienced in keeping secrets to hide something so important in places where casual intruders might stumble across it. The breakthrough came when Margaret was examining Rose's bedroom more carefully, paying attention to details she'd missed during her initial walkthrough. The room was dominated by a massive mahogany armoire that looked like it had been built to last centuries. As Margaret ran her hands along its ornate carved surfaces, she noticed that one section of decorative molding felt slightly loose. When she pressed it, a hidden panel slid aside, revealing a compartment just large enough to hold a leather portfolio. Inside the portfolio, Margaret found documents that made her hands shake as she read them. The first item was a hand-drawn map of downtown Dallas, marked with detailed notations about guard schedules, alarm systems, and escape routes for what appeared to be the First National Bank. The map was signed in 2 different hands. BP and C.B. Bonnie Parker and Clyde Barrow had personally planned this robbery, down to the minute-by-minute timing and the specific positions where lookouts should be stationed. But this wasn't just any bank robbery plan. Margaret recognized the First National Bank building from photographs she'd seen of Dallas's financial district during the Depression. This was one of the largest banks in Texas, and according to the dates on the documents, the robbery had been planned for May 15th, 1934, exactly 8 days before Bonnie and Clyde were killed in their famous ambush. They had never executed this final, most ambitious heist. Beneath the bank plans, Margaret found something even more extraordinary, a detailed list of people who were supposed to help with the robbery. Not just the usual criminal associates, but names that made Margaret's heart race as she recognized them from Rose's research files. Police officers, bank employees, city officials, people who were supposed to ensure that the robbery went smoothly and that Bonnie and Clyde could escape without interference. One name in particular jumped out at her: Detective Raymond Murphy, Dallas Police Department. According to the documents, Murphy was supposed to ensure that police response to the bank alarm would be delayed by at least 15 minutes, giving the robbers time to complete their work and disappear into the network of safe houses that had been prepared throughout the city. In exchange, Murphy would receive 25% of the stolen money, enough to make him wealthy beyond anything his police salary could provide. Margaret cross-referenced the name with Rose's research files and discovered that Detective Murphy had not died in obscurity. After leaving the Dallas Police Department in 1935, he had moved to California, where he had somehow acquired enough capital to start a private security company that had grown into one of the largest firms on the West Coast. His son had inherited the business and expanded it further, and his grandson was currently running Murphy Security Systems, a company that protected some of California's wealthiest families and most important businesses. The implications hit Margaret like a physical blow. If these documents were authentic, they proved that one of California's most respected security companies had been built on money that was supposed to come from robbing banks with Bonnie and Clyde. The Murphy family's entire fortune was based on a crime that had never been committed, but which had been planned in detail with their ancestors' full participation. Margaret continued reading, finding similar information about other individuals who had been part of the planned robbery network. James Whitmore, who had been scheduled to provide the getaway vehicles, had later become a successful automobile dealer in Houston. Sarah Chen, and Margaret felt another shock of recognition at the surname, had been responsible for providing false identification documents and had later moved to California, where she had started a family. Margaret frantically searched through Rose's genealogical files, tracing the connections between Sarah Chen and her own family tree. The revelation was devastating. Margaret's own great-grandmother had been part of Bonnie and Clyde's criminal network. Sarah Chen had married a man named William McKinnon shortly after moving to California, taking his surname and becoming the mother of Rose McKinnon. Margaret's great-grandmother had been a forger and document falsifier for the most famous criminals in American history. This explained why Rose had been so secretive about the family's past, why Margaret's mother had been uncomfortable during visits to Rose's house, and why Rose had spent decades researching the connections between legitimate society and Depression-era crime. Rose hadn't just been protecting evidence about other people's criminal associations. She had been protecting the secret of her own family's involvement with Bonnie and Clyde. Margaret sat on Rose's bed, surrounded by documents that could destroy reputations, end political careers, and bring down business empires that had been built on carefully hidden foundations. She understood now why Rose had received threatening letters and why powerful people had wanted her research stopped. The information Rose had collected didn't just document historical corruption. It provided evidence of ongoing cover-ups that extended into the present day. The leather portfolio contained one more item that made Margaret's blood run cold. A letter from Bonnie Parker to Rose, written in Bonnie's distinctive handwriting just days before the ambush that killed her and Clyde. The letter was both a confession and a warning, revealing the true scope of the corruption they had uncovered. During their crime spree, "Dearest Rose," Bonnie had written, "if you're reading this, it means Clyde and I didn't make it out alive, and the secrets we've been carrying have become your burden to bear. What we discovered during our time on the run is worse than anyone realizes. We weren't just robbing banks, Rose. We were being used by people much more powerful than us, people who wanted certain financial records destroyed and certain witnesses silenced. The banks we hit weren't chosen randomly. Each one contained evidence of illegal activities by wealthy investors, corrupt politicians, and crooked law enforcement officials. Our job wasn't just to steal money. It was to destroy documents that could have sent dozens of powerful people to prison. They made it look like we were just desperate kids gone wrong, but we were actually working for some of the most respectable names in Texas business and politics. The problem is that we learned too much, saw too much, and they decided we'd become a liability. The law enforcement officials who are supposed to be hunting us are actually planning to kill us, not capture us. They can't risk a trial where we might tell the truth about who was really behind our activities. I've given you copies of everything we collected, Rose. Bank records, correspondence, photographs, lists of names and amounts paid. It's all there. Proof that the Depression wasn't just a natural economic disaster. It was engineered by people who profited from the suffering of ordinary families. They used the chaos to cover their own crimes and used criminals like us to clean up the evidence. I don't know what you should do with this information. It's too dangerous to make public while these people are still alive and powerful, but it's too important to destroy. Maybe someday, when enough time has passed, someone will be able to use it to get justice for all the people who suffered while rich men got richer off their misery. Be careful, Rose. These people have killed before, and they won't hesitate to kill again if they think their secrets are threatened. Trust no one completely, especially anyone who offers to help you deal with this information. The truth is more valuable than gold, but it's also more dangerous than anything you can imagine. With love and regret, Bonnie. Margaret read Bonnie's letter 3 times, trying to absorb its implications. According to Bonnie Parker, she and Clyde Barrow hadn't been independent criminals operating on their own initiative. They had been hired guns, working for corrupt business and political leaders who had used the chaos of the Great Depression to cover their own massive crimes. The famous outlaws had been expendable assets, killed when they became inconvenient. To their powerful employers, if Bonnie's account was accurate, then the official history of the Depression era was fundamentally wrong. The economic collapse hadn't been just a natural consequence of speculation and poor regulation. It had been deliberately manipulated by criminal conspirators who had profited enormously from the suffering of ordinary Americans. The bank failures, the farm foreclosures, the massive unemployment, all of it had been engineered to benefit a small group of wealthy criminals who had used the crisis to consolidate their power and eliminate their competition. Margaret felt overwhelmed by the magnitude of what she had discovered. Rose's research wasn't just about one famous criminal couple, it was about systemic corruption that had shaped American history for nearly a century. The people and institutions Rose had been investigating weren't just historically significant, they were the foundations of current wealth and power structures that still influenced politics and economics today. She spent the rest of the day cross-referencing the names in Bonnie's documents with Rose's research files, building a clearer picture of how the conspiracy had operated. The pattern was sophisticated and far-reaching. Corrupt bank officials had created artificial crises that forced small banks to fail, allowing larger institutions to acquire their assets at fire-sale prices. Crooked politicians had passed legislation that benefited specific wealthy interests while appearing to be general economic reforms. Law enforcement officers had selectively enforced regulations, protecting connected criminals while prosecuting their competitors. Bonnie and Clyde had been part of a network that had included dozens of other criminals, all working to eliminate evidence and silence witnesses who might have exposed the conspiracy. Their bank robberies had targeted specific institutions that contained records of illegal transactions. Their kidnappings had focused on people who had knowledge of corrupt activities. Their murders had eliminated individuals who posed threats to powerful conspirators. Margaret realized that Rose had spent 30 years not just collecting this information, but also verifying it through independent research. The filing cabinets full of bank records, police reports, and personal correspondence weren't just random. Historical documents. They were carefully assembled evidence that corroborated Bonnie's claims about systematic corruption during the Depression era, but Rose had also discovered something else. The conspiracy hadn't ended with Bonnie and Clyde's deaths. Many of the people involved had continued their criminal activities, using the wealth and power they had accumulated during the Depression to expand their influence. Their children and grandchildren had inherited not just money, but also ongoing criminal enterprises that had evolved with changing times. The Murphy family's security company, for example, wasn't just built on stolen money. It was still being used to protect clients whose wealth came from illegal sources. The automobile dealership started by James Whitmore had become a network of businesses throughout Texas that were still used to launder money from various criminal activities. The political connections that had protected the original conspirators had been passed down through generations, creating dynasties of corruption that influenced government policy at state and federal levels. Margaret understood now why Rose had been so careful about protecting this information and why she had received threats and warnings over the years. The people Rose had been investigating weren't just historical figures. They were current power brokers whose continued wealth and influence depended on keeping these secrets buried. Exposing the truth about the Depression-era conspiracy would destroy not just reputations, but entire business empires and political careers that had been built on criminal foundations. As evening fell over Bakersfield, Margaret sat in Rose's study, surrounded by evidence that could reshape American history, and wondering what she was supposed to do with such dangerous knowledge. Her financial crisis seemed trivial compared to the responsibility she had inherited. She had come looking for something valuable enough to pay her debts, but she had found something so valuable and so dangerous that it could cost her life. The eviction notice in her purse seemed like a problem from another lifetime. Margaret was no longer just a bankrupt widow trying to avoid homelessness. She was the keeper of secrets that powerful people had killed to protect, and they would undoubtedly be willing to kill again to keep those secrets safe. But Margaret was also beginning to understand that she might not be as helpless as she had initially thought. The information Rose had collected wasn't just historically significant, it was potentially worth millions of dollars to the right buyers. People who had built their fortunes on hidden crimes would pay enormous amounts to keep evidence of those crimes from becoming public. Margaret had inherited not just dangerous knowledge, but potentially the solution to every financial problem she had ever faced. The question was whether she was brave enough or desperate enough to use it. Margaret's investigation into her grandmother's secrets was interrupted at 8:30 the next morning by an unexpected visitor. She was in Rose's kitchen, making coffee and trying to decide her next move, when a sharp knock echoed through the quiet house. Through the front window, she could see a tall man in an expensive suit standing on the porch, briefcase in hand, looking like he belonged in a corporate boardroom rather than on the doorstep of a dusty Bakersfield bungalow. The man introduced himself as Michael Garrett, senior partner at Garrett, Stone & Associates, a law firm from Los Angeles. He appeared to be in his early 50s, with silver-streaked hair and the kind of confident bearing that suggested he was accustomed to getting his way in high-stakes negotiations. His smile was professional but didn't reach his eyes, and Margaret immediately sensed that this wasn't a social call. "Mrs. Chen," Garrett said, extending a business card printed on expensive paper. "I represent certain parties who have an interest in your grandmother's estate. I was hoping we could discuss a mutually beneficial arrangement regarding some items that may be in your possession." Margaret felt her heart rate increase, but she kept her expression neutral. Less than 24 hours after discovering Rose's explosive documents, people were already coming forward to claim them. "I'm not sure what you're referring to, Mr. Garrett. I'm still going through my grandmother's belongings." Garrett's smile became more forced. "Mrs. Chen, let's speak plainly. Your grandmother, Rose McKinnon, spent decades collecting materials related to certain historical events. My clients are prepared to make you a very generous offer for any documents or artifacts from the 1930s that might be among her possessions." The fact that Garrett knew about Rose's research and that he had found Margaret so quickly confirmed her worst fears about the dangers she was facing. Someone had been monitoring Rose's activities closely enough to know immediately when the house changed hands, and they were moving fast to secure whatever information Rose had been protecting. "What kind of generous offer?" Margaret asked, inviting Garrett into the living room, while her mind raced through possible strategies for handling this confrontation. Garrett opened his briefcase and withdrew a legal document. "My clients are prepared to purchase any historical materials from your grandmother's collection for $500,000. No questions asked. The transaction would be completely confidential, and you would be free to sell the property and move on with your life without any further complications. $500,000 would solve all of Margaret's financial problems and give her enough money to start over anywhere she chose. It was more money than she had ever imagined having, and it was being offered for materials she hadn't even finished examining. The fact that unknown parties were willing to pay such an enormous sum confirmed that Rose's documents were even more valuable than Margaret had realized. "That's a substantial offer," Margaret said carefully, "but I'd need to know more about who I'm dealing with and why these materials are so important to your clients." Garrett's expression hardened slightly. "Mrs. Chen, my clients value their privacy, which is why they're willing to pay such a premium for discretion. The materials in question relate to historical events that, while fascinating to researchers, could cause unnecessary embarrassment to certain families if they became public. My clients simply want to preserve the dignity of people who are no longer alive to defend themselves." Margaret recognized the careful language of someone who was used to negotiating deals that couldn't be discussed openly. Garrett was confirming that his clients knew exactly what Rose had been collecting and that they were willing to pay enormous sums to keep that information from becoming public. The reference to protecting the dignity of dead people was particularly telling. It suggested that Garrett's clients were descendants of the criminals and conspirators Rose had been investigating. "I understand the desire for privacy," Margaret replied, "but $500,000 is a significant amount of money. I'd need some time to consider such an offer, and I'd want to understand exactly what materials you're interested in purchasing." Garrett reached into his briefcase again and withdrew a manila folder. "Perhaps this will help clarify the situation, Mrs. Chen. My clients are aware that your current financial circumstances are challenging. They understand that you're facing foreclosure on your home in Riverside, and they want to help you resolve those difficulties as quickly as possible." Margaret felt a chill as Garrett opened the folder and began laying out documents on Rose's coffee table. Her mortgage statements, credit card bills, medical debt from David's cancer treatment, even her employment records from the Riverside Library. Someone had compiled a complete dossier on her financial situation, documenting every aspect of her economic crisis in precise detail. "How did you get these?" Margaret asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. "Mrs. Chen, when significant amounts of money are involved, due diligence is essential. My clients needed to understand your situation in order to make an appropriate offer." Garrett's tone was matter-of-fact, as if having someone investigated without their knowledge was a routine business practice. The message was clear. Margaret was dealing with people who had extensive resources for gathering information, and monitoring potential threats to their interests. If they could compile a complete financial profile on her within hours of her arrival in Bakersfield, they could probably track her movements, monitor her communications, and anticipate her actions with disturbing accuracy. There's also this to consider, Garrett continued, withdrawing another document from his folder. Your grandmother received numerous warnings over the years about the dangers of her research activities. People who possessed sensitive historical materials have sometimes found themselves in unfortunate situations. The document Garrett placed on the table was a newspaper clipping from 1987 describing the death of Harold Fitzpatrick, a retired bank executive who had been killed in what police described as a robbery gone wrong. According to the article, Fitzpatrick had been researching Depression-era banking practices and had recently claimed to have discovered evidence of widespread corruption during the 1930s. Margaret's hands trembled as she read the details. Fitzpatrick had been found dead in his home office, shot twice in the head execution style. His research materials had been stolen, but expensive electronics and jewelry throughout the house had been left untouched. Police had concluded that the killer was specifically interested in Fitzpatrick's historical documents, not his personal valuables. Mr. Fitzpatrick was a meticulous researcher, much like your grandmother, Garrett said quietly. Unfortunately, he refused several generous offers to sell his materials to private collectors who valued discretion. His death was a tragic reminder that historical research can sometimes lead people into dangerous territory. The threat was unmistakable, though carefully couched in language that maintained plausible deniability. Garrett was telling Margaret that Rose's documents had gotten people killed before, and that refusing his client's offer could result in similar consequences for her. Margaret forced herself to remain calm, though her mind was racing with fear and calculation. Mr. Garrett, I appreciate your client's generous offer, but this is all very sudden. I need time to inventory my grandmother's belongings properly before I can make any decisions about selling them. Garrett's expression became cold and businesslike. Mrs. Chen, I should mention that my client's offer is time-sensitive. The historical materials we're discussing have been the subject of ongoing legal disputes, and there are questions about their proper ownership. My clients are willing to overlook any potential legal complications in exchange for a quick, confidential transaction. But that generosity has limits. Margaret understood that Garrett was now threatening her with lawsuits and legal harassment if she didn't accept his offer. People with enough money and legal resources could tie her up in court for years, bankrupting her with attorney fees even if she ultimately won any legal battles. What kind of legal complications? Margaret asked, though she suspected she knew the answer. Garrett withdrew yet another document from his seemingly endless briefcase. Some of the materials your grandmother collected may have been obtained through questionable means. Historical documents that were reported stolen from various archives and private collections over the years. If you were found to be in possession of stolen property, even unknowingly, the legal consequences could be severe. The document Garrett showed her was a list of museum thefts, archive break-ins, and private collection burglaries dating back decades. Someone had been systematically stealing original documents related to Depression-era crime and corruption, and Garrett was suggesting that Rose had been involved in these thefts. Margaret didn't believe for a moment that Rose had been a thief, but she understood that proving her grandmother's innocence would require time, money, and legal expertise she didn't possess. Garrett's clients could make her life extremely difficult by claiming that any valuable documents in Rose's possession had been stolen from their rightful owners. I think I understand the situation, Mr. Garrett, Margaret said, standing up to signal that the meeting was over. You'll have my answer within 48 hours. Garrett gathered his documents and returned them to his briefcase, but his expression suggested he wasn't pleased with Margaret's response. Mrs. Chen, I hope you'll carefully consider the full implications of your decision. My clients are reasonable people who prefer to resolve matters amicably, but they have legitimate interests to protect." After Garrett left, Margaret double-locked the front door and closed all the curtains, feeling like she was under siege in her grandmother's house. The comfortable illusion that she could simply sell Rose's property and walk away from her problems had been shattered. She was now dealing with people who had the resources to investigate her background, threaten her with lawsuits, and possibly arrange for her to meet the same fate as Harold Fitzpatrick. But Garrett's visit had also provided Margaret with valuable information about her situation. The fact that his clients were willing to pay $500,000 for Rose's documents meant that the materials were worth far more than that to the right buyers. If Margaret could find those buyers, she might be able to start a bidding war that would increase the value of her inheritance exponentially. More importantly, Garrett's threats had revealed the extent of the conspiracy Margaret was dealing with. The people who wanted Rose's documents weren't just concerned about historical embarrassment. They were actively engaged in covering up ongoing criminal activities that stretched back decades. The theft of documents from museums and archives suggested a systematic effort to eliminate evidence of Depression-era corruption from the historical record. Margaret spent the rest of the day researching Michael Garrett and his law firm, using Rose's computer and internet connection to dig into their client list and case history. What she discovered confirmed her suspicions about the scope of the conspiracy she was facing. Garrett, Stone, and Associates specialized in representing wealthy families and major corporations in sensitive legal matters that required absolute discretion. Their client list read like a who's who of California business and political elite, including several names that Margaret recognized from Rose's research files. The law firm had been founded in 1965 by Michael Garrett's father, who had previously worked as a prosecutor in Texas during the 1930s and 1940s. The connection wasn't coincidental. The elder Garrett had been part of the original cover-up of Depression-era corruption, using his position as a prosecutor to protect the criminals Rose and Bonnie had identified in their documents. His son had inherited not just a law practice, but also the responsibility for continuing to protect the families and institutions that had benefited from those original crimes. Margaret also discovered that several of Garrett's current clients had business interests that trace back to the Depression era. Murphy Security Systems was indeed among the firm's clients, as was Whitmore Automotive Group and several major banks that had emerged from the consolidation that followed the banking crisis of the 1930s. The conspiracy that Bonnie Parker had described in her letter to Rose wasn't just historical. It was an ongoing criminal enterprise that had evolved and expanded over nearly a century. As the sun set over Bakersfield, Margaret realized that she was facing a choice that would determine the rest of her life. She could accept Garrett's offer, take the money, and try to disappear somewhere that his clients couldn't find her. She could refuse the offer and risk the same fate that had befallen Harold Fitzpatrick and possibly others who had possessed inconvenient evidence. Or she could find a way to use Rose's documents to expose the truth about the conspiracy, bringing justice for all the people who had suffered while criminals prospered for nearly a century. Margaret thought about Rose's letter, warning that the truth was more valuable than gold, but also more dangerous than anything she could imagine. Her grandmother had spent 30 years protecting this information, waiting for someone who would be brave enough to use it properly. The eviction notice in Margaret's purse reminded her that she had less than 2 weeks to make a decision that would affect not just her financial future, but potentially the future of American democracy itself. The documents hidden in Rose's house contained evidence that could bring down some of the most powerful people in the country, but using that evidence would require courage, intelligence, and resources that Margaret wasn't sure she possessed. As she sat in Rose's study, surrounded by decades of carefully assembled evidence, Margaret Chen began to understand that she wasn't just the inheritor of family secrets. She was potentially the key to exposing one of the longest-running criminal conspiracies in American history. The question was whether she was brave enough to use that key, knowing that doing so might cost her everything, including her life. Margaret's decision about how to handle Michael Garrett's ultimatum was complicated the next morning by the arrival of someone who appeared to be the complete opposite of the slick Los Angeles attorney. Dr. Elena Vasquez knocked on Rose's front door at 7:30 a.m., carrying a worn leather satchel and wearing the kind of practical clothing that suggested she spent more time in archives than boardrooms. Dr. Vasquez introduced herself as a professor of American history at UC Berkeley, specializing in Depression-era economics and criminal justice. She was a small woman in her late 40s, with graying hair pulled back in a simple ponytail and intelligent dark eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. Unlike Garrett, whose every word had seemed calculated for maximum impact, Dr. Vasquez spoke with the directness of someone who valued truth over persuasion. "Mrs. Chen," Dr. Vasquez said after Margaret had invited her inside, "I knew your grandmother. We corresponded for several years about her research into Depression-era corruption. I was hoping to discuss some materials she mentioned in her letters that might be relevant to a book I'm writing about systematic criminal conspiracy during the 1930s. Margaret felt a mixture of relief and wariness. After Garrett's threatening visit, it was reassuring to meet someone who seemed genuinely interested in historical truth rather than cover-up. But Rose's warnings about trusting no one completely echoed in Margaret's mind as she studied this unexpected visitor. "My grandmother never mentioned corresponding with historians," Margaret said carefully. "Can you tell me more about your relationship with her?" Dr. Vasquez opened her satchel and withdrew a folder containing copies of letters written in Rose's familiar handwriting. "Your grandmother contacted me 3 years ago after reading an article I published about irregularities in bank failure patterns during the Depression. She believed she had evidence that would support my thesis about coordinated manipulation of the financial crisis." Margaret examined the letters, confirming that they were indeed written in Rose's hand. The correspondence revealed that Rose had been in contact with several legitimate historians and researchers, sharing selected information from her collection. While carefully protecting the most sensitive materials, Dr. Vasquez appeared to be one of the few people Rose had trusted with significant details about her discoveries. "According to these letters," Dr. Vasquez continued, "your grandmother possessed original documents that could prove the existence of a criminal conspiracy involving major banks, law enforcement agencies, and political figures during the Depression. She mentioned having materials that came directly from participants in the conspiracy, including some that were provided by Bonnie Parker and Clyde Barrow." Margaret felt her pulse quicken. If Dr. Vasquez was legitimate, she might be exactly the ally Margaret needed to figure out how to use Rose's documents safely and effectively. But if she was working for the same interests as Michael Garrett, she could be even more dangerous because she seemed trustworthy. "Dr. Vasquez, how did you know to come here now? My grandmother died over 30 years ago." The professor smiled sadly. "Rose continued writing to me until about 6 months ago. Her last letter mentioned that she was getting older and was concerned about what would happen to her research if something happened to her. She said she had made arrangements for her materials to go to a family member, and she gave me your contact information in case I needed to reach you after her death." Margaret felt confused. "But my grandmother died 30 years ago, not 6 months ago." Dr. Vasquez looked genuinely puzzled. "Mrs. Chen, I received a letter from Rose McKinnon just this past December. She was living in this house and conducting active research. Are you certain we're talking about the same person?" The revelation hit Margaret like a physical blow. The woman who had been writing to Dr. Vasquez, the woman who had been living in this house and paying property taxes through an old bank account, the woman who had left specific instructions with Eleanor Whitfield about contacting Margaret. That woman was not Margaret's biological grandmother who had died when Margaret was 12. Someone else had been using Rose McKinnon's identity, living in Rose McKinnon's house and continuing Rose McKinnon's research for the past 3 decades. Margaret had inherited not just a property and a collection of documents, but the life and work of a woman she had never actually met. "Dr. Vasquez," Margaret said slowly, "I think we need to have a much longer conversation about exactly who Rose McKinnon was and what she was researching." Over the next 2 hours, Dr. Vasquez told Margaret a story that transformed her understanding of everything she had discovered. The woman who had been living as Rose McKinnon was actually Sarah Chen, Margaret's great-grandmother, who had faked her death in 1955 and assumed her daughter's identity to continue investigating the conspiracy she had helped create during the 1930s. According to Dr. Vasquez's research, Sarah Chen had been consumed by guilt over her role in providing false documents for Bonnie and Clyde's criminal network. After moving to California and starting a family, she had tried to live a normal life, but the knowledge of what she had participated in and what powerful people had gotten away with had haunted her for decades. When the real Rose McKinnon died in 1991, Sarah had seen an opportunity to dedicate the rest of her life to exposing the truth about the conspiracy. She had faked her own death, assumed her deceased daughter's identity, and moved into Rose's house in Bakersfield, where she had spent 30 years methodically building a case against the criminals who had manipulated the Great Depression for their own profit. "The woman you knew as your grandmother Rose was actually your great-grandmother Sarah," Dr. Vasquez explained. "She told me she chose this deception because she needed to disappear from her old life completely in order to research the conspiracy safely. Too many people knew Sarah Chen's connection to Bonnie and Clyde, but Rose McKinnon was just an amateur genealogist with an interest in family history." Margaret felt overwhelmed by the complexity of the deception. The secretive woman she remembered, visiting as a child, had been her great-grandmother, not her grandmother, and everything about those childhood visits made more sense now. Sarah's intense focus on historical research, her paranoia about keeping secrets, her warnings about trusting no one, all of it reflected the perspective of someone who had lived through the original conspiracy and understood its continuing dangers. "Dr. Vasquez, if my great-grandmother was still alive 6 months ago, what happened to her? Why am I inheriting the house now?" The professor's expression became somber. According to her last letter, Sarah believed she was being watched by people who had discovered her true identity. She was making arrangements to transfer her research to someone she trusted, someone who could continue the work if something happened to her. She specifically mentioned you, Mrs. Chen, saying that you had the intelligence and determination needed to handle such dangerous material. Margaret realized that her great-grandmother's death had probably not been natural. If Sarah had been discovered by the same people who were now pressuring Margaret to sell the documents, they might have decided that eliminating an elderly woman was easier than negotiating with her. "The timing is suspicious," Dr. Vasquez continued. "Sarah's death occurred just as I was finalizing publication of my book about Depression-era corruption. She had promised to provide me with documentary evidence that would make the book impossible to ignore or dismiss. Her death prevented that from happening, and now certain parties are clearly trying to acquire her materials before they can be used by researchers like myself." Margaret understood now why Michael Garrett had moved so quickly to make his offer. Sarah's death had created a narrow window of opportunity for the conspiracy to acquire and destroy the evidence she had spent 30 years collecting. But they needed to act fast before legitimate historians or law enforcement agencies became aware of what Sarah had discovered. Dr. Vasquez, assuming I trust you, and I'm not saying I do yet, what would you suggest I do with these materials? The professor leaned forward, her expression intense. Mrs. Chen, what your great-grandmother collected isn't just historically significant, it's evidence of ongoing criminal activity. The people she was investigating didn't just commit crimes during the Depression and then retire. They built criminal enterprises that have continued operating for nearly a century, evolving and expanding with each generation. Dr. Vasquez opened her satchel again and withdrew a thick manuscript. This is my book about the Depression-era conspiracy. It's scheduled for publication next month, but without the documentary evidence Sarah promised to provide, it will be dismissed as speculative. Fiction. The people I'm exposing have enough influence to discredit any historian who challenges their version of events. Margaret flipped through the manuscript, seeing chapter titles that corresponded exactly to the subjects Sarah had been researching. The Banking Conspiracy of 1933, Criminal Law Enforcement during the Roosevelt Administration, The Systematic Looting of Failed Banks, Political Protection of Organized Crime Networks. But if I could supplement the book with original documents, Dr. Vasquez continued, particularly materials that came directly from participants like Bonnie Parker and Clyde Barrow, it would be impossible to dismiss or suppress. The evidence would be so overwhelming that even the most corrupt officials couldn't prevent a full investigation. Margaret saw the appeal of Dr. Vasquez's proposal, but she also understood the risks. Publishing Sarah's documents would certainly expose the conspiracy, but it would also make Margaret a target for the same forces that had been trying to suppress this information for decades. "What about my safety?" Margaret asked directly. "Michael? Garrett made it clear yesterday that people who possess these materials sometimes meet unfortunate ends." Dr. Vasquez nodded grimly. "That's why we need to move quickly and carefully. Once the information is published and widely distributed, killing you becomes counterproductive. It would only draw more attention to the evidence. But during the period between deciding to publish and actually getting the information out, you're extremely vulnerable." The professor outlined a plan that was both simple and terrifying in its implications. Margaret would provide her with copies of Sarah's most important documents, which Dr. Vasquez would rush into publication as a supplement to her book. Simultaneously, they would contact investigative journalists, law enforcement agencies, and other historians, ensuring that multiple copies of the evidence existed in multiple locations. "The key is speed and redundancy," Dr. Vasquez explained. "We flood the zone with information so quickly that the conspiracy can't suppress it all. Once the story breaks in multiple venues simultaneously, the people you're dealing with will be too busy protecting themselves to worry about eliminating you." Margaret spent the rest of the morning examining Dr. Vasquez's credentials and publications, verifying that she was indeed a legitimate historian with an established record of research into Depression-era corruption. The professor's previous work had been published by university presses and peer-reviewed journals, and her reputation in academic circles appeared to be solid. But Margaret also remembered Sarah's warning about trusting no one completely. Even if Dr. Vasquez was legitimate, she might be naive about the dangers they were facing, or she might be unknowingly working with people who had infiltrated academic circles to monitor and suppress inconvenient research. "Dr. Vasquez," Margaret said finally, "I need to think about this carefully. Can you give me until tomorrow to make a decision?" The professor agreed, but her expression suggested she understood the urgency of their situation. "Mrs. Chen, I should mention that Michael Garrett contacted me yesterday, asking about my relationship with your grandmother. He offered to pay." me a substantial amount for any material Sarah had shared with me, and he made it clear that refusing his offer could have negative consequences for my academic career. This confirmed Margaret's suspicion that Garrett's clients were moving on multiple fronts to acquire or suppress Sarah's evidence. They weren't just pressuring Margaret directly, they were also targeting anyone who might have received copies of the documents or who might be able to verify their authenticity. "What did you tell him?" Margaret asked. "I told him I needed time to consider his offer," Dr. Vasquez replied. "But Mrs. Chen, I should be clear about something. I've spent my entire career researching this conspiracy, and I believe exposing it is more important than my personal safety or professional success. If you decide to trust me with these materials, I will publish them regardless of the consequences." As Dr. Vasquez prepared to leave, she handed Margaret a secure phone and detailed instructions for encrypted communication. "If you decide to work with me, use this phone to contact me. Assume that all your regular communications are being monitored, and don't discuss any of this with anyone unless you're certain they can be trusted." After the professor left, Margaret sat in Sarah's study, surrounded by evidence that could reshape American history, and wondering whether she was brave enough to use it. She had two offers on the table: Garrett's $500,000 buyout that would solve her financial problems but leave the conspiracy intact, or Dr. Vasquez's proposal to expose the truth regardless of the personal cost. Margaret thought about Sarah's letter warning that the truth was more valuable than gold, but more dangerous than anything imaginable. Her great-grandmother had spent 30 years building a case against criminals who had profited from one of the worst economic disasters in American history. Sarah had sacrificed her normal life, her family relationships, and ultimately her safety, to gather evidence that could bring justice to people who had never been held accountable for their crimes. The question was whether Margaret had inherited not just Sarah's evidence, but also her commitment to seeing justice done, regardless of the personal cost. As evening approached, Margaret realized that her decision would determine not just her own future, but potentially the future of American democracy itself. The documents hidden in Sarah's house represented the last chance to expose a criminal conspiracy that had been operating with impunity for nearly a century. But using those documents would require Margaret to risk everything she had left, including her life, on the hope that truth was indeed more powerful than the forces that had been suppressing it for so long. Margaret's decision was forced upon her at 3 o'clock the following morning, when she was awakened by the sound of someone attempting to break into Sarah's house. She had been sleeping fitfully on the living room sofa, her dreams filled with images of Bonnie and Clyde and faceless men in expensive suits, when the distinct sound of metal tools working on the back door lock brought her instantly awake. Moving as quietly as possible, Margaret crept to the kitchen window and peered through the curtains. Two figures dressed in dark clothing were working systematically on the door, using professional locksmith tools rather than the crude prying implements a typical burglar might use. These weren't random criminals looking for easy valuables. They were professionals who had come specifically for Sarah's documents. Margaret's first instinct was to call the police, but Sarah's warnings about corrupt law enforcement echoed in her mind. If Michael Garrett's clients had enough influence to threaten historians and monitor communications, they probably had contacts within local police departments who could ensure that any break-in report would be ignored or delayed until the intruders had completed their work. Instead, Margaret grabbed the secure phone Dr. Vasquez had given her and sent a brief, encrypted message: "They're inside the house. Need help immediately." Then she gathered the most important documents from Sarah's study, Bonnie's letter, the bank robbery plans, and the lists of corrupt officials, and stuffed them into a backpack along with her grandmother's research notes. And some of the most damaging photographs. The back door lock gave way just as Margaret finished securing the documents. She could hear careful footsteps moving through the kitchen and whispered voices discussing how to search the house systematically without leaving evidence of their presence. Margaret realized these weren't just burglars. They were professionals conducting a covert intelligence operation. Margaret had explored Sarah's house thoroughly over the past few days, and she remembered seeing a basement entrance through a door off the main hallway. She made her way there as quietly as possible, descended into the dark basement, and discovered that it connected to the garage through an underground passage that Sarah had apparently constructed for exactly this type of emergency. The garage contained Sarah's ancient pickup truck, which Margaret had noticed but not examined carefully. The keys were hanging on a hook beside the door, and Margaret realized that Sarah had prepared multiple escape routes from the house in case her enemies ever discovered her location. The truck started on the first try, despite its age, and Margaret was able to drive out of the garage and down the alley behind Maple Street without being detected by the intruders. As she drove through the darkened streets of Bakersfield, Margaret's phone buzzed with an encrypted response from Dr. Vasquez. Safe house address attached. Come immediately, bring everything. The address was for a small apartment complex on the other side of town, and Margaret arrived there 20 minutes later to find Dr. Vasquez waiting in the parking lot with a man she introduced as Detective James Rodriguez from the California State Police. Detective Rodriguez was a stocky man in his 40s with intelligent eyes and the bearing of someone who had seen enough corruption to be suspicious of everyone. He examined Margaret's identification carefully and asked detailed questions about the break-in before seeming satisfied that she was legitimate. Mrs. Chen, Rodriguez said as they climbed the stairs to a second-floor apartment that Dr. Vasquez had apparently rented as a secure meeting location. Dr. Vasquez has briefed me on the general nature of your situation, but I need to understand exactly what we're dealing with before I can determine how to help you. Inside the apartment, Margaret spread Sarah's documents across a dining room table while Dr. Vasquez and Detective Rodriguez examined them with the careful attention of professionals who understood their significance. Rodriguez's expression grew increasingly grim as he read through Bonnie Parker's letter and the lists of corrupt law enforcement officials. Jesus Christ, Rodriguez muttered after examining the bank robbery plans and the names of people who were supposed to facilitate them. If these documents are authentic, they prove that some of California's most prominent families built their fortunes on criminal activity during the Depression. Dr. Vasquez was photographing each document with a high-resolution camera, creating digital copies that could be distributed quickly if necessary. Detective Rodriguez specializes in investigating organized crime with political connections. I contacted him after Michael Garrett threatened me because I thought we might need law enforcement assistance. Rodriguez looked up from the documents with an expression that mixed excitement with deep concern. Mrs. Chen, what you've inherited isn't just historical evidence. It's proof of ongoing criminal conspiracy. Some of the people named in these documents are still alive, and their children and grandchildren are currently holding positions of power throughout California government and business. Margaret felt the full weight of her inheritance settling on her shoulders. She wasn't just dealing with historical secrets, she was threatening current power structures that involved living people with enormous resources for protecting themselves. What kind of power are we talking about? Margaret asked. Rodriguez consulted his notes from examining the documents. Murphy Security Systems has contracts with the state government worth hundreds of millions of dollars. Whitmore Automotive Group owns dealerships throughout the Southwest and has close relationships with several major banks. The political connections go all the way to the U.S. Senate. Senator Patricia Caldwell's grandfather was one of the corrupt officials listed in these documents. Dr. Vasquez looked up from her photography work. Margaret, we're not just exposing Depression-era crimes. We're threatening to bring down a network of wealthy and powerful families who've been protecting each other for nearly a century. Margaret understood now why Sarah had been so careful about protecting this information, and why she had spent 30 years building an ironclad case before attempting to expose the conspiracy. The people they were dealing with had enough wealth and influence to destroy anyone who threatened them, unless the evidence against them was so overwhelming that denial became impossible. "Detective Rodriguez," Margaret said, "what would happen if we tried to take this evidence to local law enforcement?" Rodriguez's expression was grim. "Honestly, some agencies are clean, but others have been compromised for decades. The corruption networks your great-grandmother documented didn't disappear. They evolved and adapted. There are police departments, sheriff's offices, and even federal agents who are either directly connected to these families or who have been bought off over the years." The scope of the conspiracy was beginning to overwhelm Margaret. She had imagined dealing with a few wealthy families, trying to hide embarrassing historical connections. But the reality was far more complex. She was facing a criminal network that had infiltrated law enforcement, government, and business at every level. However, Rodriguez continued, there are also clean agencies and honest officials who would love to get their hands on evidence. Like this. The problem is identifying who can be trusted and getting the information to them before the corrupt officials can suppress it. Dr. Vasquez finished photographing the documents and began organizing them into categories based on the type of evidence they represented. "We need a multi-pronged approach. Simultaneous release to academic publishers, investigative journalists, law enforcement agencies, and congressional oversight committees. Make it impossible for any single corrupt official or organization to suppress all the information." Margaret watched the two professionals planning their assault on nearly a century of hidden crimes and felt both inspired and terrified. These people were willing to risk their careers and possibly their lives to expose the truth. But Margaret was the one who would bear the greatest risk because she was the primary source of the evidence. "What about my safety during this process?" Margaret asked. "The people who broke into Sarah's house tonight weren't there to negotiate. They were there to steal the documents and probably eliminate me as a witness." Rodriguez nodded grimly. "That's why we need to move fast. The longer this drags out, the more opportunities they have to silence you. But once the information is public, killing you becomes counterproductive. It would only validate the evidence and draw more attention to their crimes." The detective outlined a timeline that was both ambitious and terrifying. Within 48 hours, they would need to have copies of Sarah's documents in the hands of at least a dozen different organizations and individuals, all of whom would release the information simultaneously to prevent any single entity from suppressing it. Dr. Vasquez will rush her book into publication with a major commercial publisher who has the resources to resist legal challenges, Rodriguez explained. "I'll get copies to state and federal law enforcement agencies that I trust. We'll also need to contact investigative journalists at major newspapers and television networks." Margaret felt overwhelmed by the complexity of what they were proposing. How do we know which journalists and law enforcement officials can be trusted? If this conspiracy is as extensive as these documents suggest, couldn't some of them be compromised? 2. "We can't know for certain," Dr. Vasquez admitted, "but we can hedge our bets by approaching multiple people in each category. Even if some of them are corrupt, others will be clean, and the sheer volume of simultaneous revelations will make it impossible to suppress everything." Rodriguez was studying a list of names from Sarah's documents, cross-referencing them with his knowledge of current political and business connections. There's another advantage to moving quickly. Some of the people named in these documents are elderly or in poor health. If we can get them to testify before they die, we can lock in their statements and make it harder for their families to deny the truth. Margaret spent the next several hours working with Dr. Vasquez and Detective Rodriguez to develop a comprehensive plan for exposing the conspiracy. They identified specific journalists, academics, and law enforcement officials who would receive copies of the documents. They planned the timing of each revelation to maximize impact and minimize the opportunity for suppression. They even discussed Margaret's safety, including the possibility of placing her in protective custody once the information became public. But as dawn approached, Margaret found herself thinking about something beyond the immediate crisis. Sarah had spent 30 years of her life building this case, sacrificing her normal existence to gather evidence against criminals who had never been held accountable for their actions. Margaret was being asked to continue that work, to risk everything in pursuit of justice for people who had died decades ago. Dr. Vasquez, Margaret said as they finalized their plans, what happens after we expose all this? Even if we bring down the current generation of criminals, won't someone else just take their place? The professor looked thoughtful. That's possible. But exposing this conspiracy would also expose the methods they've used to maintain power. For nearly a century, it would make it much harder for similar networks to operate in the future because people would know what to look for. Rodriguez nodded in agreement. Plus, there's a deterrent effect. When powerful people see that their crimes can be exposed even decades later, it makes them more cautious about committing new ones. Margaret realized that the decision she was making went beyond her personal situation or even her financial crisis. She was choosing whether to help break a cycle of corruption that had been operating since the Great Depression, whether to use her great-grandmother's sacrifice to make meaningful change in how power operated in American society. The sun was rising over Bakersfield as Margaret made her final decision. She looked at the documents spread across the table, evidence of nearly a century of criminal conspiracy, proof that some of America's most respected families had built their fortunes on the suffering of ordinary people during the worst economic crisis in the nation's history. Dr. Vasquez, Detective Rodriguez, Margaret said, her voice steady despite the fear she felt. Let's do this. Let's expose every one of these bastards and make sure they finally pay for what they've done. The two professionals smiled at her decision, but Margaret could see in their eyes that they understood the magnitude of what they were undertaking. They weren't just planning to reveal historical secrets. They were declaring war on a criminal network that had operated with impunity for nearly a century. As they began the final preparations for their coordinated assault on the conspiracy, Margaret felt a strange sense of peace settling over her. She'd come to Bakersfield hoping to find something valuable enough to solve her financial problems, but she had discovered something far more important: the opportunity to complete her great-grandmother's life work and bring justice to people who had never expected to be held accountable for their crimes. The eviction notice in her purse seemed like a trivial concern compared to the responsibility she had accepted. Margaret Chen was no longer just a bankrupt widow trying to avoid homelessness. She was the inheritor of one of the most important collections of evidence in American criminal history, and she was finally ready to use it. The coordinated release of Sarah's documents began at exactly 6 a.m. Pacific time on Thursday morning, time to hit news cycles across multiple time zones simultaneously. Margaret sat in the secure apartment, watching Dr. Vasquez monitor responses on her laptop, while Detective Rodriguez fielded calls from law enforcement agencies across 3 states. The plan was working exactly as they had hoped, and that terrified Margaret more than any of the previous threats she had faced. The first breakthrough came when Dr. Vasquez received confirmation that her publisher had fast-tracked the release of her book with Sarah's documents included as a special appendix. They're calling it the most significant historical discovery since the Pentagon Papers, Dr. Vasquez reported, her voice tight with excitement and nervousness. The legal department has reviewed everything and confirmed that we have sufficient documentation to defend against any libel claims. Rodriguez's phone hadn't stopped ringing since 7 a.m. That was the FBI field office in Sacramento, he told Margaret after ending another call. They want to interview you about the documents, and they're opening formal investigations into 3 of the families named in Sarah's materials. The agent I spoke with said they've been trying to build cases against some of these organizations for years, but they never had enough evidence to justify the resources. Margaret felt a mixture of vindication and terror as she watched the conspiracy she had inherited begin to crumble in real time. The documents that had seemed like abstract historical curiosities just days ago were now triggering criminal investigations, congressional inquiries, and front-page newspaper stories that would reshape how Americans understood their own history. But the response from Michael Garrett's clients was swift and ruthless. By 9 a.m., Margaret's secure phone was buzzing with text messages from numbers she didn't recognize, all containing variations of the same threat. "You've made a terrible mistake. There's still time to fix this, if you cooperate." More concerning were the calls Detective Rodriguez was receiving from law enforcement colleagues, warning him about pressure from above to cease his involvement in the case. "Someone with serious juice is making phone calls," Rodriguez told Margaret grimly. "I've got captains and deputy chiefs who owe me favors telling me to back off, that this is too big for state-level law enforcement to handle." Dr. Vasquez was facing similar pressure from academic administrators who had suddenly developed concerns about the university's liability in publishing materials that implicated powerful families. "The dean called me an hour ago, suggesting that I take a sabbatical while the legal issues get sorted out," she reported. "Someone is making serious threats about pulling funding from the history department." Margaret realized that even though their plan was succeeding in getting the information public, the conspiracy still had enough influence to create significant obstacles for anyone trying to pursue the evidence. The criminal network Sarah had spent 30 years investigating wasn't going to collapse overnight. It was going to fight back with every resource at its disposal. The first indication of how far they were willing to go came at 11 a.m. when Eleanor Whitfield called Margaret's regular phone number. Margaret's elderly neighbor in Bakersfield sounded frightened and confused as she described men in expensive suits who had arrived at her house asking detailed questions about Margaret's activities and demanding to know where she had gone. "They weren't police, honey," Eleanor said, her voice shaking. "They showed me some kind of identification, but they didn't act like any government agents I've ever seen. They wanted to know what you took from Rose's house, who you've been talking to, where you might be staying. When I told them I didn't know anything, they got very unpleasant." Margaret felt sick as she realized that her decision to expose the conspiracy had put an innocent elderly woman in danger. Eleanor had spent decades protecting Sarah's secret, and now she was being threatened because of Margaret's choices. "Mrs. Whitfield, are you safe? Do you need me to send someone to help you?" "I called my grandson in Los Angeles, and he's driving up to stay with me for a few days," Eleanor replied. "But Margaret, these men made it clear that they know how to find you, and they're not going to stop looking. You need to be very careful." After ending the call, Margaret turned to Rodriguez and Dr. Vasquez with growing concern. "How long before they figure out where we are? And what happens to the people helping us when they do?" Rodriguez's expression was grim as he consulted his notes about their current security situation. "This apartment is rented under a false name, with cash payments. But if they have the resources I think they do, they'll track us down eventually. We need to assume we have maybe 24 hours before they locate us." Dr. Vasquez was monitoring news coverage of their document release. and her reports suggested that the conspiracy was already mounting a sophisticated counterattack. They're not just trying to suppress the story, they're trying to discredit it. I'm seeing articles questioning the authenticity of the documents, suggesting that they might be elaborate forgeries created by historical fiction writers. Margaret examined the news coverage on Dr. Vasquez's laptop and was disturbed by how quickly opposing narratives were emerging. Well-funded public relations firms were clearly working around the clock to create doubt about Sarah's evidence, using the same techniques that had been perfected by tobacco companies and climate change deniers to muddy waters around inconvenient scientific findings. "Look at this," Dr. Vasquez said, pointing to an article in a prominent financial newspaper. "They're already describing our revelations as unsubstantiated conspiracy theories promoted by disgruntled academics and attention-seeking amateur historians. They're making it sound like we're the criminals for exposing their crimes." Rodriguez was receiving updates from law enforcement contacts who were working to verify Sarah's documents through official channels. The good news is that the FBI's Document Analysis Unit has confirmed that the paper, ink, and handwriting samples we provided are consistent with materials from the 1930s. The bad news is that someone is leaking information about the investigation to the subjects of the inquiry. Margaret felt the walls closing in around them as she realized that even legitimate law enforcement agencies contained people who were either corrupt or compromised. The conspiracy Sarah had documented wasn't just historical. It was still actively protecting itself through networks of influence that extended into every institution that might pose a threat. The breakthrough that changed everything came at 2 p.m. when Rodriguez received a call from an unexpected source. Retired FBI agent Patricia Morrison, who had spent 30 years investigating organized crime before leaving the agency in frustration over political interference in high-profile cases. Agent Morrison says she's been tracking some of the same criminal networks that Sarah documented, Rodriguez reported after a lengthy phone conversation. "She has independent evidence that corroborates what we've found, and she's been waiting for someone to come forward with the kind of proof that Sarah collected." Dr. Vasquez looked up from her laptop with renewed excitement. "If we have a retired FBI agent who can verify our findings independently, it becomes much harder for them to dismiss everything as fraudulent conspiracy theories." Rodriguez was already making arrangements to meet with Agent Morrison at a secure location where they could coordinate their evidence and plan their next moves. "She wants to examine Sarah's original documents personally, and she has contacts in federal law enforcement who are completely clean. People she's worked with for decades who can't be bought or intimidated." Margaret felt a surge of hope as she realized that Sarah's 30 years of careful research might finally achieve its intended goal. But she also understood that they were entering the most dangerous phase of their campaign, when the conspiracy would be most desperate to prevent further exposure. The afternoon brought confirmation of Margaret's fears when Dr. Vasquez received word that her office at UC Berkeley had been burglarized overnight. "They took my computer, all my files related to Depression-era research, and every piece of correspondence I had with Sarah over the past 3 years," she reported grimly. "Campus security is calling it a random break-in, but nothing else was touched." Rodriguez's contacts in law enforcement were reporting similar incidents. 3 different agencies that received copies of our documents have had their evidence rooms compromised in the past 12 hours, he told Margaret. "Someone is mounting a systematic campaign to retrieve or destroy every copy of Sarah's materials they can locate." Margaret realized that their strategy of distributing copies widely was being countered by people with enough resources and inside knowledge to track down and eliminate evidence across multiple institutions simultaneously. The conspiracy wasn't just wealthy and influential. It was also extremely well organized and capable of coordinating complex operations on short notice. But their enemy's desperation was also creating opportunities. Agent Morrison's independent investigation had been stalled for years by lack of concrete evidence, but Sarah's documents provided exactly the breakthrough she needed to move forward with criminal referrals that had been sitting on her desk for decades. Morrison has contacts in the Justice Department who specialize in prosecuting historical war crimes and human rights violations, Rodriguez explained. She thinks they might be interested in Sarah's evidence because some of the financial crimes documented in these materials technically have no statute of limitations. Dr. Vasquez had been researching the legal implications of their discoveries and had found precedents that suggested major prosecutions might still be possible. There's case law from Nazi war crimes prosecutions that establish principles for holding people accountable for systematic criminal enterprises, even decades after the original crimes were committed. If Sarah's documents can prove ongoing criminal conspiracy, the statute of limitations might not apply. Margaret felt overwhelmed by the possibility that her great-grandmother's evidence might not just expose historical corruption, but actually result in criminal prosecutions of people who were still alive and active in American business and politics. The scope of what they were attempting was far larger than she had initially understood. The day's most significant development came when Agent Morrison arrived at their secure apartment carrying a briefcase full of materials that complemented Sarah's documents perfectly. Morrison was a compact woman in her 60s with silver hair and the direct gaze of someone who had spent decades dealing with dangerous criminals. Her presence immediately changed the dynamic in the room, adding the authority of someone with extensive federal law enforcement experience. "Mrs. Chen," Morrison said after examining Sarah's documents for over an hour, "your great-grandmother assembled one of the most comprehensive criminal case files I've ever seen. I've been investigating these same families and organizations for 30 years, but I never had access to the kind of primary source evidence she collected." Morrison spread her own materials across the dining room table, showing how her independent research corroborated and extended Sarah's findings. What Sarah documented during the Depression era wasn't the end of these criminal enterprises. It was just the beginning. The same families and organizations have been involved in systematic criminal activity for nearly a century, evolving their methods but never abandoning their basic approach. The retired agent's evidence included financial records showing suspicious transactions, surveillance reports documenting meetings between supposedly legitimate business leaders and known criminals, and testimony from witnesses who had been too frightened to come forward while they were still active federal employees. The problem I always faced was that these people are too wealthy and too well connected to prosecute without absolutely ironclad evidence, Morrison explained. District attorneys won't take cases against powerful families unless they're certain of conviction because the political costs of losing are too high. But Sarah's documents changed that calculation completely. Dr. Vasquez was taking detailed notes about the connections between Morrison's evidence and Sarah's materials. "Agent Morrison, if we can establish continuous criminal enterprise spanning from the 1930s to the present, what kind of prosecutions become possible?" Morrison's smile was grim but determined. "We're talking about RICO prosecutions that could bring down entire criminal organizations, asset forfeiture that could recover billions of dollars in illegally obtained wealth, congressional investigations that could expose corruption at the highest levels of government. This isn't just about historical justice, it's about dismantling criminal networks that are still operating today." Margaret felt the full weight of her inheritance settling on her shoulders as she realized that Sarah's documents weren't just historically significant, they were the key to prosecutions that could reshape American business and politics. The responsibility was enormous, but so was the opportunity to achieve justice that had been delayed for nearly a century. As evening approached, the team began planning their next moves with Agent Morrison's extensive federal contacts. The retired agent had maintained relationships with clean prosecutors, honest judges, and investigative journalists who had been waiting for exactly the kind of evidence Sarah had assembled. "We need to move fast," Morrison warned. "The people we're dealing with have shown they're willing to kill to protect their secrets, and they're going to become increasingly desperate as more evidence becomes public. Our window of opportunity is closing, but if we act decisively in the next 48 hours, we can trigger investigations that will be impossible to stop." Margaret looked around the room at the three people who had risked their careers and their safety to help her expose her great-grandmother's secrets. Dr. Vasquez had jeopardized her academic position to publish Sarah's research. Detective Rodriguez had defied pressure from his superiors to support their investigation. Agent Morrison had come out of retirement to pursue cases that had haunted her for decades. They were preparing to take on some of the most powerful families in America, people who had been protected by wealth and influence for nearly a century. The odds against them were enormous, but Margaret finally understood why Sarah had spent 30 years building such a comprehensive case. Her great-grandmother had known that exposing this conspiracy would require overwhelming evidence and extraordinary courage from everyone involved. The fight for justice was just beginning, but for the first time since discovering Sarah's documents, Margaret felt confident that they might actually win. More concerning were the calls Detective Rodriguez was receiving from law enforcement colleagues warning him about pressure from above to cease his involvement in the case. "Someone with serious juice is making phone calls," Rodriguez told Margaret grimly. "I've got captains and deputy chiefs who owe me favors telling me to back off, that this is too big for state-level law enforcement to handle." The first indication of how far they were willing to go came at 11 a.m. when Eleanor Whitfield called Margaret's regular phone number. Margaret's elderly neighbor in Bakersfield sounded frightened and confused as she described men in expensive suits who had arrived at her house asking detailed questions about Margaret's activities and demanding to know where she had gone. They weren't police, honey," Eleanor said, her voice shaking. "They showed me some kind of identification, but they didn't act like any government agents I've ever seen. They wanted to know what you took from Rose's house, who you've been talking to, where you might be staying. When I told them I didn't know anything, they got very unpleasant." Margaret felt sick as she realized that her decision to expose the conspiracy had put an innocent elderly woman in danger. Eleanor had spent decades protecting Sarah's secret, and now she was being threatened because of Margaret's choices. The breakthrough that changed everything came at 2 p.m. when Rodriguez received a call from an unexpected source. Retired FBI agent Patricia Morrison, who had spent 30 years investigating organized crime before leaving the agency in frustration over political interference in high-profile cases. Agent Morrison says she's been tracking some of the same criminal networks that Sarah documented, Rodriguez reported after a lengthy phone conversation. "She has independent evidence that corroborates what we've found, and she's been waiting for someone to come forward with the kind of proof that Sarah collected." When Agent Morrison arrived at their secure apartment that evening, she carried a briefcase full of materials that complemented Sarah's documents perfectly. Morrison was a compact woman in her 60s with silver hair and the direct gaze of someone who had spent decades dealing with dangerous criminals. "Mrs. Chen," Morrison said after examining Sarah's documents for over an hour, "your great-grandmother assembled one of the most comprehensive criminal case files I've ever seen. I've been investigating these same families and organizations for 30 years, but I never had access to the kind of primary source evidence she collected." Morrison spread her own materials across the dining room table, showing how her independent research corroborated and extended Sarah's findings. What Sarah documented during the Depression era wasn't the end of these criminal enterprises. It was just the beginning. The same families and organizations have been involved in systematic criminal activity for nearly a century, evolving their methods but never abandoning their basic approach. The retired agent's evidence included financial records showing suspicious transactions, surveillance reports documenting meetings between supposedly legitimate business leaders and known criminals, and testimony from witnesses who had been too frightened to come forward while they were still active federal employees. Morrison has contacts in the Justice Department who specialize in prosecuting historical war crimes and human rights violations, Rodriguez explained. She thinks they might be interested in Sarah's evidence because some of the financial crimes documented in these materials technically have no statute of limitations. Morrison's smile was grim but determined. We're talking about RICO prosecutions that could bring down entire criminal organizations, asset forfeiture that could recover billions of dollars in illegally obtained wealth, congressional investigations that could expose corruption at the highest levels of government. This isn't just about historical justice. It's about dismantling criminal networks that are still operating today. Margaret felt the full weight of her inheritance settling on her shoulders as she realized that Sarah's documents weren't just historically significant. They were the key to prosecutions that could reshape American business and politics. The responsibility was enormous, but so was the opportunity to achieve justice that had been delayed for nearly a century. The final confrontation came 18 months later in a federal courthouse in Los Angeles, where Margaret sat in the witness stand holding the original photograph that had started everything, the faded image of Bonnie Parker and Clyde Barrow with their signatures scrawled across detailed bank robbery plans. The courtroom was packed with reporters, federal agents, and family members of the defendants who sat at 3 separate defense tables. Senator Patricia Caldwell, CEO David Murphy III, and businessman James Whitmore Jr. had all been indicted under the Racketeer-Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act, charged with participating in a criminal enterprise that had operated continuously since the 1930s. Margaret's testimony had taken 3 days, walking the jury through every document Sarah had collected, every connection she had traced, every piece of evidence that proved these families had built their fortunes on systematic criminal activity spanning nearly a century. "Mrs. Chen," the lead prosecutor asked, "can you tell the jury what motivated your great-grandmother to spend 30 years of her life gathering this evidence?" Margaret looked across the courtroom at the defendants, seeing in their faces the same arrogance and entitlement that had allowed their families to operate with impunity for so long. She felt responsible for the suffering caused by the conspiracy she had unknowingly helped create. She wanted to make sure that someday justice would finally be served. The trial's most dramatic moment came when Dr. Vasquez presented her analysis of how the Depression-era conspiracy had evolved over the decades. Using charts and timelines that filled the courtroom's walls, she showed how the same criminal methods had been adapted to take advantage of every major economic crisis since the 1930s. The defense's case crumbled when Agent Morrison presented recordings of conversations between the defendants that had been captured during the FBI's surveillance operation. In these conversations, the defendants discussed their families' historical crimes in detail and even made plans to eliminate Margaret if she couldn't be bought off or intimidated into silence. "We can't let this get out," Senator Caldwell could be heard saying on one recording. My grandfather's involvement with Bonnie and Clyde was supposed to stay buried forever. If people find out that our family fortune came from robbing banks and murdering witnesses, my political career is over." The jury deliberated for only 6 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all counts. The judge delivered sentences that reflected the scope and duration of the criminal enterprise. Life in prison without parole for all 3 defendants, forfeiture of assets worth over $2 billion, and orders to pay restitution to victims, families and communities that had been harmed by their crimes. Margaret felt tears of relief and vindication as she watched the defendants being led away in handcuffs. Sarah's 30 years of sacrifice had finally achieved their intended goal. Justice for people who had thought they were untouchable, accountability for crimes that had shaped American history, and exposure of corruption that had operated in shadows for nearly a century. Margaret used the reward money from the federal government to establish the Sarah Chen Foundation, dedicated to supporting historians and investigators who were researching systematic corruption and criminal conspiracy. The Foundation's first project was digitizing Sarah's complete research archive and making it available to scholars worldwide. The photograph of Bonnie Parker and Clyde Barrow now hung in the Smithsonian Institution as part of an exhibit about Depression-era crime and corruption. The museum's placard described it as one of the most significant historical documents ever discovered by a private citizen. But Margaret knew it represented something more important: proof that truth really was more valuable than gold, and that justice, however delayed, could still be achieved by people brave enough to fight for it. Standing outside the federal courthouse after the sentencing, Margaret thought about Sarah's final letter, the one that had warned about the responsibility that came with inheriting dangerous knowledge. Margaret had accepted that responsibility and used it to complete her great-grandmother's mission, bringing justice to people who had committed crimes that had shaped American history for nearly a century. The eviction notice that had driven Margaret to Bakersfield seemed like a relic from another lifetime. She had gone looking for something valuable enough to solve her financial problems and had found something infinitely more valuable: the opportunity to expose truth, achieve justice, and honor the sacrifice of a woman who had spent her entire life protecting evidence that would finally hold powerful criminals accountable for their actions. Margaret Chen had inherited more than just a house full of secrets. She had inherited the chance to change history itself. And as she drove away from the courthouse, heading back to the new life she had built with the Foundation's work, Margaret knew that Sarah would have been proud of what her dangerous inheritance had finally accomplished. Thank you for joining us on this incredible journey through Margaret Chen's discovery of her family's dangerous secrets and her fight for justice against a conspiracy that spanned nearly a century. If you enjoyed this story of courage, corruption, and historical truth, please like this video and subscribe to our channel for more compelling tales of ordinary people who found themselves in extraordinary circumstances. Don't forget to hit the notification bell so you never miss our latest stories. And let us know in the comments what you thought about Margaret's incredible adventure. Would you have had the courage to take on such powerful enemies? What would you have done with Sarah's dangerous inheritance? Subscribe now for more amazing stories. And remember, sometimes the most valuable treasures are the ones that come with the greatest risks.